No, no, no. I think we're good. Okay.
Welcome to the National Association of Scholars. We are today presenting a webinar titled Broken Title IX Due Process and the Cost Students Pay. This is a great opportunity for us. We're going to be releasing officially at this moment a new report titled Dear Colleague, the Weaponization of Title IX. If you're tuned in, I'm confident that you know something about Title IX, but a recapitulation might well be in order. Title IX is the 1972 law passed by Congress that outlaws sexual discrimination in higher education. It was originally intended for an academic purpose, but it very quickly moved into the realm of student athletics, and then it was off to the races with many other applications developed mainly through litigation in the decades that followed that. All was more or less well until 2011, when the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education issued first to the president of the University of Montana what was called a Dear Colleague letter. Well, a Dear Colleague letter is not a law, it's not even a regulation, it's simply a letter that expresses an opinion. The opinion in this case was that unless the University of Montana pulled itself together and started active prosecution of students who were alleged to have committed violations of sexual misconduct, it would find itself in jeopardy of losing its access to federal funds. The letter also came with a provision that although the OCR was writing to the University of Montana, it expected that all colleges and universities would be following suit, that this would be a new kind of regime in American higher education, adroitly managed without the assistance of either House of Congress in passing a law or the process of public disclosure and debate that goes into making regulations. So a handful of people decided these would be the new rules, and they went into effect. They did some strikingly unusual things. First of all, sexual assault would normally be considered a more grievous action than sexual discrimination. But since the law, Title IX, dealt with sexual discrimination, they took the greater harm and bundled it into the lesser harm and decided that for henceforth, rapes, attempted rapes, sexual assaults, and so forth would be treated as discriminatory acts. The reasoning behind this was that such acts would harm the ability of the students who had been assaulted to pursue an education on an equal basis with other students who hadn't been assaulted. That's the logic. No sooner had this new regime taken effect than a cadre of campus officials, Title IX officers, found themselves with astonishing new powers. The Title IX re-regulation, or the Dear Colleague letter, said that these officials, in order to be sort of autonomous and able to do their jobs well, would report directly to the presidents of their colleges and universities. All the intervening layers of hierarchy that normally would have some checks and balances on campus bureaucrats were erased in favor of direct to the president reporting, which in most cases meant no reporting at all. The second thing that it did was it empowered these stewards of Title IX with a kind of plenipotentiary powers. They became the people who received complaints, who investigated the validity of those complaints. They became the people who counseled the complainant, but they also counseled the person who was accused. They then became the adjudicatory body, the body that wrestled with the evidence one way or the other and came up with a verdict. So the roles of juries and judges were combined into one, along with the roles of police and investigators and psychological counselors. The role of the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney were also combined into one in the hands of this one person. And finally, that one person was given the authority to decide the fate of the accused. Now, as we on this call probably all know, the consequence of this was a regime of terror on campus. Many students found themselves accused, sometimes on no basis whatsoever, and the Title IX authorities decided to make examples of them and rule that they had to be expelled from campus or face other rather severe disciplinary consequences. Since 2011, when this regime came into place, some 600 of those students, presumably a small fraction of those who were actually unjustly accused, have turned to the courts for relief and sought from judges a declaration that they had been denied due process under the law. In about half of those cases, the courts have sided with these plaintiffs and forced the colleges and universities to undo the mischief. But nobody has been able to undo the mischief of these superpowered Title IX authorities or the government that backed them up until a few years ago, Secretary DeVos of the Department of Education decided that it was time to put Title IX Dear Colleague letter on some kind of legitimate regulatory footing. She drafted, or the staff drafted, a set of regulations that went all the way through the normal regulatory process. Those came into effect after strenuous opposition by Title IX officers and many college and university presidents. They went into effect this August. We're now at the stage where the new rules are being challenged in a series of lawsuits. 4 of them have been filed so far. And the question is going to be whether the new rules will withstand further judicial scrutiny. In the midst of all of this, the National Association of Scholars inserted itself. Early on, we thought that there were problems with Title IX. The NAS can't really do anything else on its own unless it finds grant support, people willing to pay for our efforts. One such angel stepped forth about a year and a half ago and gave us the funding we needed to hire Teresa Manning, who is here on this call and is the main author of the report. Teresa spent over a year visiting college campuses, talking to Title IX officers, talking to students, doing legal research into the history of the Title IX episode, some of which I've just summarized for you, and drafting the report that we are about to release today. So I'm going to introduce Teresa, but we also have 2 respondents to Teresa here as well, Joseph Roberts and Kathy Young. So I'm going to introduce all 3 of them and then get out of the way. I'll be back later on for the Q&A period. So Teresa is the policy director of the National Association of Scholars. And she's the author, as I said, of today's report. That's titled Dear Colleague, The Weaponization of Title IX. Teresa is a graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law in 1993 after completing her first year at the law school at McGill University in Montreal. She has a master's degree in Western European history from Washington University in St. Louis. Her BA is in philosophy, and it's from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. Before joining the National Association of Scholars, Teresa served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Population Affairs in the Department of Health and Human Services in the US government. Next, Joseph Roberts. He is currently a law student at Golden State University of Law in San Francisco. And I think you can see San Francisco behind him. He is a graduate of Savannah State University. He's also served in the US Navy and is currently running for a seat in the San Francisco County Republican Central Committee. He has successfully advocated for equal treatment and due process for those afflicted by the inequitable Title IX campus disciplinary process. His work in Capitol Hill has contributed to Title IX policy recommendations, some of which are now law. And he also helped negotiate and lobby for due process legislation across the whole country. He continues his work by collaborating with think tanks like us, law professors, and lawyers regarding higher education due process and free speech issues. And he often travels to work with state legislatures, including California, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Kathy Young is a contributing editor to Reason magazine, where I most frequently read her. She's an associate editor and columnist for Arc Digital, a weekly columnist for Newsday, and a regular contributor to the Jewish Daily Forward, Quillette, one of my favorite online magazines, and The Bulwark. Her freelance work has appeared in all sorts of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Weekly Standard, Tablet Magazine, Daily Beast, Slate, Foreign Policy, and Commentary, and that's an astonishing range of publications. She was a weekly columnist for the Detroit News and for the Boston Globe. Kathy is the author of 2 books, Growing Up in Moscow, Memories of a Soviet Girlhood from 1989, and Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality from 1999. She's also a media fellow with the Cato Institute, and while her writing deals with a wide range of topics, gender issues and feminism have been the major and consistent focus of her work. Her perspective is generally critical of both modern feminism and gender traditionalism, while stressing individual rights, empowerment, equity, and fairness for both sexes. Now, before I turn this over to Teresa, I think we'll have a word from Chance Layton, who is our communications director, about how we're going to proceed from here. Chance?
Yes, hello everybody. So just a general format. Teresa is going to speak about her new report, and then we'll bounce between Joseph, Kathy, and then Teresa for discussion and Q&A. All of you in the audience, I would encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see it if you hover your mouse. There you can ask questions, and we will do our best to answer those during the Q&A or during the webinar itself. So that's it from me. Teresa?
Great. Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone in attendance. I hope you will read the report and find it useful. It was designed to give both a legal background to the Title IX law, but also its current operation on campus, so that readers could more effectively participate in discussions and debates on Title IX, which we will definitely be having going forward. Before going into the 3 areas I wanted to discuss, I'd like to make 2 preliminary remarks. The first is, before I started this project, I was always somewhat confused how a civil rights law, that is a ban on discrimination, could be dealing with sexual assault or other matters that were fundamentally criminal in nature. And I still think that that's a very good question. And I think that tension of Title IX as a civil rights law, a discrimination ban, trying to address conduct which is fundamentally criminal, that tension continues to hover over all Title IX administration and discussion. It's as if we are trying to square a circle, and there is reasoning to support this connection, but I think it's under discussed, and I think the confusion is understandable because of these 2 areas of law. On that note, and secondly, is the word assault, which comes up a lot in Title IX discussions and has a very ugly, brutal imagery to it. But I can report that from my visits on campus, there was no talk of weapons, physical injuries, strangers, or anything that we would typically associate with the criminal nature of assault. 95% of Title IX cases on campus are a result of what are called hookups or transient sexual encounters. That is, students who voluntarily are engaging in sexual intimacy in the context of a frat party or other party environment, usually just the 2 of them, so there are no witnesses presenting he said, she said proof problems, where something goes wrong. So the focus of most Title IX adjudication is on consent and not force. And it's important, I think, to have that context in mind as we discuss the particulars of everyone's situation and the findings of the report. So I'd like to focus my remark on 3 areas. First is the composition of the Title IX office itself. Second is the cultural leanings of campus personnel who are involved in Title IX adjudications. That was a surprise to me that it is not just the Title IX office, but there are also partner entities, that's my term, including women's centers, health centers, wellness centers, affirmative action divisions, and equity and inclusion offices. Often on a campus, these various bureaucracies occupy the same office space, and various people from these offices participate in the hearings. So the personnel involved there are relevant for the discussion of Title IX administration. Then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about student attitudes. So first, for the composition of the Title IX offices. In brief, they are almost exclusively female, they are heavily feminist, and they lack basic relevant legal experience. So let's turn to the easiest metric, that of the female-male ratio. In 4 of the campuses surveyed, the Title IX office had 0 men on staff. In the other 2, the female-male ratio was 5-2 and 6-3. I like this metric because it is straightforward and easy to verify, but also I should mention that in regular courtrooms and legal proceedings, there is a lot of talk of impartial decision makers, neutral proceedings, and even the appearance of fairness. In cases that involve he said, she said, which often pit the word of a male student against a female student, you obviously have a male-female tension. And so the absence of men on staff already runs afoul of the legal convention that judges in courtrooms should satisfy an appearance of fairness. Making matters worse, however, is that the academic and professional background of most of the Title IX staff is heavily skewed toward disciplines such as women's studies, gender studies, or gender-based violence studies. Most come from university administration and have done stints in the affirmative action office or in affirmative action consulting. So obviously these are backgrounds which are politicized and politically charged. So they are bringing these backgrounds to the table in cases that are already highly emotional and highly fraught. So this is worth noting for professionals who are purporting to serve as neutral investigators, coordinators, and adjudicators. Third, and related, and no less important, is the lack of real relevant legal experience, which we view as courtroom experience, ideally and specifically criminal defense experience. We think at the National Association of Scholars that if there is going to be an adjudication like a legal proceeding, those involved in such adjudications should have real live courtroom experience representing parties to a dispute. Part of this should be just obvious that once you have served in the role of representing a client who's been accused of wrongdoing, that you are especially sensitive to the rights that that client has, including the usual, the presumption of innocence, the right to know the particulars of charges against you, the right to respond to those charges, the right to impartial decision makers, and the right to appeal. There is no substitute for having that personal professional experience, because as anyone who has worked in the area of criminal defense knows, those aspects of your work then become second nature, and slip-ups or oversights or the lack of protection for those due process rights won't happen because you will be there to check it. As an aside, I should mention that our system is a system of adversarial litigation, as opposed to other Western nations which have an inquisitorial legal system. An adversarial system is unpleasant, of course, but the advantage of having adversaries, that is, people who represent one party and representing another, is that they check each other for their missteps and their excesses. In Title IX administration, it really looks much more like an inquisitorial system where you have the inquisitors all of a piece and on one side against the accused. If someone on staff had criminal defense experience, had participated in the adversarial litigation system, it would bring the balance that the adversarial system brings. Okay, the second area has to do with the cultural leanings of the campus personnel that I met. The campus personnel in health centers and women's centers are basically pushing a sexual hedonism. They are not only encouraging hookups, which is to say these impersonal, numerous, and non-committal sexual encounters, but they are exhorting students to engage in hookups, qualifying this sometimes by calling them healthy hookups. So, for example, at Virginia Tech, an entity called Catharsis Productions was brought in to talk to students. Catharsis Productions is all about promoting healthy hookups. And if you look online for what their educators discuss with students, it includes statements such as, go have an orgasm, go hook up. It's all good. We want healthy hookups. So this is explicit in their language, and it's also by suggestion. Outside most of the Title IX offices that I visited, there were bowls of condoms, pamphlets regarding sexual activity. At James Madison University at the Wellness Center, there is a condom corner accompanied by a pamphlet which explains the bottom rung of condoms, which is flavored. And if something is flavored, it is meant to be tasted. Probably the most memorable comment that I heard on my travels to these campuses was from someone working at the Well Center at James Madison University, who stated matter-of-factly that here in Title IX and in the Wellness Center, they are all about, quote, student autonomy and pleasure, whether you are a person with a penis or a person with a vagina. So there is a heavy sex ideology, which they also recognize as top-down. Gail Stern, who is the president of Catharsis Production, speaks explicitly about the need for top-down cultural reform, and specifically from leadership within universities. I'd like to comment to say that this is not actually neutral, objective, or hands-off professional conduct. These campus personnel obviously have sided with sexual hedonism, and we should recognize that all schools, all waters that we swim in have an effect on character. So this top-down cultural reform is affecting student perceptions and student character. And what is noted in the report, and I think is most ironic, is that in every other area of human activity, whether it's academics, athletics, the performing arts, we recognize the benefit of self-discipline and self-control and self-restraint, what could be called self-governance. But in the area of human sexuality, all of that has gone out the window. And this is not a neutral, objective professional posture. It is definitely advancing a particular ideology. Secondly, I think it does warp student dating and student socializing, because what we have is incessant talk about hookups, the benefits of hookups, and talk about sexual misconduct and sexual assault. This became clear in some of the interviews conducted with Laura Kipnis, who's a professor at Northwestern University, who was herself accused of a Title IX violation for an article she wrote critiquing Title IX. She reports that all the talk on campus is sexual assault or sexual hooking up, really without anything in between. This can only warp student socializing and student dating, and is clearly unfortunate, because dating and romance, of course, is difficult terrain for the best of us, for all of us, but it is especially difficult for young people coming of age. And it really does fall to grown-ups, to institutions, to help them navigate this terrain. And instead, they seem to be thrown into the hookup and encouraged to engage in sexual hedonism, using each other for sexual pleasure, and then file complaints for assault when things go wrong. Now, the final area I wanted to highlight had to do with the student attitudes themselves. And I'm just realizing if I didn't mention the role of alcohol, I should have at the beginning, because that is a key ingredient also to these encounters. According to United Educators, which is the main insurance carrier for higher education institutions, 95% of Title IX cases involve the abuse of alcohol. So it's something of a lethal mixture to get young people into a highly sexualized environment, to throw alcohol at them, and then to talk incessantly of sexual assault. With respect to student attitudes, I must say that this was probably the most surprising aspect of my findings. Overwhelmingly, the students I encountered were positive about their access to education. They were positive about the dynamic between male and female, as far as having mentors, having guidance counselors, and most reported that, in fact, all I interviewed reported that sexual assault was not a problem on campus. And they went on to lament that when they first arrived at campus, they weren't really aware of that many opportunities to socialize with students other than the party scene. So it is interesting to see that you are getting one tone and one attitude from the administrators and the campus personnel, and you are getting a different attitude from the student body. Now, it is true, I think, that at different schools, you could get different views. All of the schools I surveyed and visited were state universities with large student bodies, and there's some evidence to suggest at the more selective elite schools, the student body and the female students would be less positive, less optimistic, and they would think that sexual assault is more of a problem. And we can talk about that. I hope we can talk about that as a topic later. But the report has definitely found that there is a disconnect between the administration, campus personnel, and the student body. So to wrap up and return, a lot of the discussion with respect to Title IX understandably has been the problems of due process. And we do commend Secretary DeVos for tackling this issue and restoring due process protections to campus Title IX administration. I think one takeaway from my report, however, is that a system is only as good as the people in it. And I am worried that if the Title IX office does not change in its composition to include those who have real courtroom experience and a second nature appreciation of due process protections, and some people, including men, who could neutralize the rampant feminist ideology there, I fear that those due process protections will exist on paper and not in these Title IX hearings. And on that note, I'll hand it back to Peter Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to transition it straight over to Joseph Roberts. The floor is yours.
Okay, Peter, I really appreciate that. I'm trying to get my video on.
Ah, there we go. Mhm.
I cannot hear.
You're muted.
Okay, is this better?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah. Teresa, thank you very much for the introduction. And for those in the audience that are not aware, that's a very, very comprehensive background from the beginning to where we are now. And even I discovered new things. Um, I was falsely accused in 2013 at my university. Listening to Teresa share the findings of her research, it lets me know that not much has changed. But there is a silver lining, and that is the Secretary DeVos, the current administration, and the final rule. For me to go, I kind of want to just break it down in the three parts, or maybe even four. The first part would be what happened to me. The second part is what it was like. The third is what life is like now, and the fourth is ultimately just the outcome and what I foresee with the new provisions and the new rule from the Secretary of Education. I attended Savannah State University. It's a small Black college in Georgia. Total enrollment, maybe 5,000. I enrolled after my experience in the Navy, in the military. I matriculated through. I did everything that you would just imagine that would be what a normal guy would do in college. You build a social circle, you build a network, you achieve as much success as you can, play the sport, join the fraternity, and a month before my graduation, I was summarily suspended without knowing who my accusers were, the details of the incident, or even the things that were charged against me. I was charged with four things. One was sexual harassment, disorderly conduct, and what my university did, they just kind of just threw a litany of charges against me in an effort, as Mrs. Manning would say, to teach me a lesson. Well, the only thing about it is that, people with their will or intent, especially as administrators, they have so much power to exercise that will that they, because of the way things were, they could do it. The only thing about it is they did it without any due process or any details of the accusation. Eventually, it took me maybe like 6 or 7 months after missing graduation to even find out not only was I falsely accused and the things I was accused of were not true, they were also lies. At that moment, life afterwards, as you can imagine, I mean, I'm pretty sure you've heard this a million times over. When you're falsely accused and you feel powerless, you feel miserable, you feel helpless. The sad reality of it all is that a majority of the people, they believe the accusation, and then comes the isolation from family and friends, the loneliness, the damage to your reputation that for most of us who are falsely accused cannot be restored. I was unfortunate enough to wake up in an emergency room surrounded by first responders, later to find out that was an attempt of suicide. In my recovery, advocating turned out to be my only outlet. I met a lot of the people along the way, including Miss Young. She's on the panel with us. And how can I describe it? Without that, there would be no hope. What happens to the falsely accused? 100% of us, we do not fight and we do not argue. Some of us kind of just let it go away. We're talking about a lifetime of effort and hard work and achievement gone down the drain. Sometimes potential careers in the National Football League or the NBA. In my experience at Savannah State, Black college, Black university, Black female university president, and of course, obviously, I'm Black too. It kind of just shows that This isn't an issue of race or gender. It's just it's systemic. For the past 7 or 8 years, I spent myself digging. I spent the past 7 or 8 years digging myself out of a hole and seeking just a vindicating moment of, hey, we treated you unfairly. It's almost like that vindicating moment uh, is like chasing a shiny object because no, you don't get a letter of apology in the mail. I would probably say I've I've been fortunate enough to have several vindicating moments along the way. Um, because of my effort and my experience, I received a full scholarship to law school. Also, because of my experience, I was rejected by a majority of the universities that I applied for. I had the chance to sit across from the Secretary of Education, who told me that there's no good reason for you to be treated the way that you've been treated. Um, there have been different channels and different outlets, and because of those different channels and outlets of advocacy, it helped me restore my confidence. It helped me restore my esteem, and overall, I would say with the final rule, um, it allowed me to keep faith in the system and the government. I mean, the gears of justice, they turn, but they turn very slowly. Just a word of support to everyone that's involved, just in raising awareness and those that are afflicted by this is that, hey, be patient and help is here and help is on the way. To the students that have been affected, uh, my heart goes out to you. And, my line of communication is always open for support. I've come a long way since receiving that email in April of 2013. Um, Currently enrolled in law school. I was offered a full scholarship. I've gained experience, including lobbying Congress. And the results of that, or the realization of that, is that Congress is it's gridlocked. This cause, this issue, we're very fortunate enough. We had the right minds behind us to somehow get our issue to the top and get this issue service, this need service by the current administration. A lot changed with that. And, I don't really like to dwell into the political side of it, but this is an issue that's so politically polarizing along party lines, along gender lines, it's almost unavoidable. Uh, there's just more effort spent not wanting to politicize it than just actually saying what it is. Um, the newly established guidelines, I'm very optimistic about it because they establish fairness in how accusations of sexual assault and harassment are investigated. I'd like to talk about a couple of the bigger points of the final rule that I feel like will benefit just all students on universities and colleges, public and state. I'm sorry, private and state. For example, a lot of these provisions are things that you would think that would be automatically afforded or provided, but previous or prior to the final rule, they just weren't. Example, a college must actually investigate allegations of sexual assault or harassment. The school must investigate promptly. No more misgraduations. Accused students cannot be suspended or expelled unless they're found guilty. The way things were before is um, an accusation is made, school makes an overreaching act to correct that action. Usually it's expulsion or suspension, and the accused student has to claw or fight their way back into not only the university, but just fighting for the remainder of their education. All evidence, and not just evidence that fits the school preferred narrative, must be disclosed. Let's see, investigations cannot be conducted by administrators who have a conflict of interest, and by extension of Mrs. Manning's point, preferably an administrator with some type of legal or jurisprudence background. Um, Another point is an alleged victim's rights and privacy, including medical records, must be protected. These are things that you would think would normally have been protected by FOIA, but they just aren't. And not only are they not, they were not without penalty. But the one that stands out the most is that an alleged victim must be allowed to take steps to avoid contact with the accused, such as class schedules or housing reassignments, even if they haven't pressed criminal charges. The reason why that one sticks out the most is that it just shows that the universities are making effort to accommodate both accusers and accused. Now, the thing about it is that, one instance of sexual assault and harassment on a college campus is by far one too many. But what happens then, or what happened in the past, was once an accusation is lost, it's okay, this university or this collegial setting is now afforded to the accuser only, and the accused student, you're exiled and ostracized. It's good to know that a university can accommodate both and allow both students to continue to matriculate while they investigate. These changes, the final rule, they're not controversial. They're only controversial on college campuses where due process, even though it's one of the basic rights our country is founded on, on college campuses and universities, it has become a privilege afforded to those that are in the protected class of privilege. My situation and my story, I'm not alone. Since my lawsuit was filed, more than 150 lawsuits have been filed against universities over Title IX proceedings, even a class action at Michigan State last year. The good thing about the Michigan State case is that if a favorable ruling happens, then we could be even talking about just retroaction to some of the prior cases. I'm excited to see the outcome of that, and hopefully that Lady Justice leans in the right way. I can't say one thing. I really do appreciate everyone listening, and despite the unfairness that I experience, I still believe in justice. My faith in the government, in the system, remains the same for both sexual assault and harassment victims and the falsely accused. My journey has been long. It's been a 7 or 8 year effort that, today I feel like it was unfair, but the things that I got in exchange, as far as, just building character, resilience, perseverance, those are things that an experience like this can only afford. So definitely strengthened by the experience. I couldn't have done it alone. And I definitely want to take the time out to meet some of the key organizations that kept me inspired and kept me motivated along the way. I'm almost certain that we're familiar with FACE, Families Advocating for Campus Equality, SAVE, and FIRE is another one. All three organizations, great leadership, and those are definitely were safe spaces where I would hear things that I would never hear along the way, like there's no good reason for you've been treated the way you've been treated. Also on the panel too, Ms. Young, Kathy Young, I appreciate her activism, and thank you, Ms. Manning, for providing a platform for me to share my experience, and I appreciate the NES's work as well. So, hey everyone, this is me. 2L year in law school. Unfortunately, it's on Zoom. It's a little different, but I've overcome the worst part, but I still think about it, and it's not as haunting as it used to be, but it's an experience that I'll never forget. Thank you.
Joseph, thank you. I think that was a very heartfelt and important thing for our audience to hear. I'm going to turn now to Kathy. Kathy Young, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I am a longtime fan of the NAS. Really appreciate what you're doing, and I think this report certainly is a great contribution to the many reports on the campus culture and the campus situation that the NAS has done. Also, a shout out to Joseph. I have met him. I think we first met when Joseph spoke at a conference of the American Legal Studies Association, right? And Joseph gave there was a kind of breakout session on the campus rape or campus sexual assault situation. That was back in 2014, I think, or 15. And Joseph gave a very eloquent talk about what happened to him. And I'm so glad to see him doing better. And, having a successful life. So anyway, getting back to the issues at hand, the couple of observations I wanted to make, and I'm someone who's really been following this issue since the 1990s, believe it or not, when we had the first kind of big wave of campus sexual assault activism. I do want to say that I think it's sort of a mistake to pinpoint all of the problems as dating back to the Dear Colleague letter in 2011. I think certainly that intervention made it worse. And as we have seen with the proliferation of lawsuits, certainly there has been, since 2011, an escalation of the abuses in this area. But a lot of the problem really predate that. I mean, if you look at a lot of the discussion that was happening in the 1990s, this is really when the feminist activism in this area began, and this push to sort of redefine consent and redefine sexual assault in a way that would make it very easy to turn any sort of ambivalent or ambiguous situation into one of sexual assault. There was back in the 1990s, there was a controversy over the Antioch College Sexual Assault Code, which basically defined consent as explicit verbal consent that had to be provided sort of every step of the way. And at the time, everybody made fun of that, like even Saturday Night Live made fun of that. Now it's really pretty much the norm on I think the majority of college campuses. I mean, if you look at the student codes and the way that they define consent and they define sexual assault, a lot of them basically say, yeah, it really needs to be explicit verbal consent. And yeah, it sort of could be, nonverbal, but you really don't want to take any chances on there being any ambiguity. So again, and even like the Title IX structure, the gender equity structure, a lot of that predates 2011. Even the like some of the changes that were introduced by the Dear Colleague letter, such as the rule that basically, well, not guilt, because we're not talking about a legal situation, but responsibility can be established by a mere preponderance of the evidence, meaning that it doesn't have to be clear and convincing evidence. It's basically that if the adjudicator thinks it's even slightly more likely that the conduct occurred than it did not, then you have to find against the accused. Now, the Dear Colleague letter and the subsequent 2013 blueprint in the University of Montana case really basically made that mandatory for colleges on the threat of losing their federal funding. And again, I do think, the changes that were introduced by Betsy DeVos in that area, I think are really positive. But again, even without that 2011 intervention, I believe that close to half of all colleges already, even by then, had a preponderance of the evidence standard. So again, the rot, so to speak, really kind of goes deeper than that. And I think it would be a mistake to just blame it all entirely on the Dear Colleague letter. Again, I think it escalated things, and it did get to the point where, we've seen all these lawsuits, but there were some lawsuits even before that. They were sort of isolated and no one was really keeping track of them. But there were cases, again, that go back all the way to the 90s. One thing that I also want to say in, well, not even really disagreement, but just to sort of make a somewhat different point. I mean, I agree that the sort of aggressive promotion of hookups is not a great thing, but I think it's also a mistake to sort of to define this problem of these sort of dubious quote unquote sexual assault cases as originating solely in hookups, because actually some of the worst cases that I know about are ones stemming from long-term relationships that then broke up. I mean, there was a case at the University of North Carolina. And by the way, I want to backtrack a little bit and add that the 2011 letter also occurred in the context of a major lawsuit that was filed by, I forget exactly how many plaintiffs there were, but there was a lawsuit at the University of North Carolina. There were lawsuits. There was one at Yale. So there was a kind of upsurge of activism by these, feminist young women on campus. Who were essentially claiming that the universities were sweeping sexual assault accusations under the rug, and that these cases were not being properly processed. One of the cases at UNC was a young woman named Landon Gamble, who was dating a guy that she had been dating throughout high school. When she got to UNC, very soon she broke up with her boyfriend, and then she decided that their relationship had actually been sexually abusive throughout its duration, which began in high school, and that basically like the entire time that they were dating, he was sexually assaulting her. So and in this case, the young man was eventually cleared by a student panel that I think consisted of like 3 women and 2 men. And Landon Gamble went on the warpath and started to make these very public statements accusing this guy of sexual assault, and his life on campus was made very, very difficult. So again, there are these cases, and I think that the underlying problem is that when you define sexual assault and consent so broadly that you can really even sort of retrospectively decide that something was unwanted or unwelcome, or that it wasn't entirely freely chosen, and or you were pressured into it, and you can redefine that as non-consensual. It almost really doesn't matter whether it was in the context of a hookup or it was in the context of a long-term relationship. You can really just come back to it and say, well, actually, like this entire time that we were together, I was constantly feeling pressured into sex, and none of it was really consensual, or some of it was consensual, but on these specific occasions, like there were some activities that I didn't consent to. So, again, I think that that is something to be kept in mind. I don't think that promoting more long-term relationships and fewer hookups is necessarily a panacea. And I think one thing that I would really strongly emphasize, and I think, I don't know what kind of future reforms we're going to have in this area. Of course, right now, everything is kind of up in the air politically in terms of, a very possible change in the administration. And I want to come back to it in a minute. But I do want to say that I think one thing I haven't really seen anyone mention is that it would be really a positive thing to promote counseling, joint counseling for the parties involved in a lot of these cases. And unfortunately, right now, because it's defined as sexual assault, it's really pretty much almost impossible to do that. I mean, the only exception is that some schools have been moving toward what they call restorative justice. But that is really, and I hate to kind of use this word, but problematic in its own way, because that requires the accused to admit guilt, or to admit that essentially he, and usually it's a he, did in fact commit sexual assault, and then you can sort of start making amends instead of necessarily emphasizing punishment. But I think that's an approach that really doesn't encourage the accuser at all to take responsibility for their actions, even in cases where it really is a kind of mutual miscommunication or misunderstanding, or a mutual dynamic where there were, contributing actions on both sides. And, just to make clear, I'm not talking about, mutual responsibility in the context of, oh, you know, she was flirting, so he was justified in, you know, physically forcing her into sex. No, it's really more that, again, there are mixed signals. And we're talking, as Teresa was saying, in the vast majority of these cases, there is no real sort of physical force involved. There may be a kind of mutual give and take where, you know, one person thinks that they are sending signals that they would like to stop, and maybe those are really ambiguous signals, and, you know, the miscommunication happens. And I think in many of those cases, it would be really helpful for the two people to sit down together with a counselor, with somebody who has, you know, experience in maybe, you know, relationship counseling, dealing with conflict and whatever. And just having the two people talk through this and, you know, help the two people see where the other is coming from, and, you know, why the other person feels aggrieved, you know, what was done that, you know, made somebody feel victimized, and so on and so forth. And I think that would be tremendously helpful in many of these cases. Again, the problem is that under current rules, and I don't think the Betsy DeVos reforms really have done anything to challenge that. That would be impossible, because we're talking about approaching it in a framework of sexual assault. And of course, if you're talking about like real sexual assault, where you know, somebody is actually forced against their will into sexual contact, yeah, I totally agree that it would be inappropriate in that context to have the two people sit down and, you know, talk it out, just as, you know, we're not going to have a mugger and the mugging victim, you know, sit down and, you know, chat about their relationship dynamics. But when we're talking about a lot of these ambiguous situations, there was one case that I wrote about 6 years ago, a guy named Dan Copin, at Brown University. He and the young woman, Lena Sklove, had this sort of on and off relationship where they sort of, you know, they hooked up a few times, and they were also good friends. It was sort of a friends with benefits thing. And they had decided a couple of times that they were going to stop the sexual aspect of the relationship and just be friends. And then they kind of drifted back into having sex. And finally, like on the last of these occasions, the woman felt very upset after the sexual experience, and part of that may have been because they essentially got kind of walked in on by his roommates, and she felt very embarrassed. And then the next day, she basically emailed him to say that she felt that he had raped her, and eventually he was suspended for a year. When he came back to campus, she embarked on this furious activism, saying that she felt that the penalty was inadequate. And eventually, just the atmosphere on campus got, even before he was able to return to campus, he decided that he was going to drop out because it would just be impossible for him to be on campus. And and then she went public. You know, she was being promoted, I think, by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand as, you know, one of the sexual assault victims that she was championing. And I wrote about Dan Copin's case. I interviewed him and his parents. And one thing that really struck me was that his father said, you know, when he first got a call from, or I think he got a letter or something, there was basically a notification from Brown that his son was being accused of sexual assault and was, you know, in danger of being suspended or expelled. And Dan essentially told his parents his side of what happened. And I mean, I think he fully admitted that his behavior was kind of stupid, you know, because he and this young woman had repeatedly sort of decided that they were not going to have sex again, and then they just kind of drifted back into it. And he, again, like he admitted that there was kind of stupid and irresponsible behavior on both sides. And his father went to talk to the dean, and basically said, look, why don't you just have the two of them sit down together with a counselor and talk about it? Because it sounds like, this is something that could be resolved if they could only like meet and talk it over in a kind of structured context. And the dean basically said, no, this is a sexual assault case. Like, there's no way, absolutely, like, never that we can do that. And that I thought was really interesting, because again, I think that in many of those cases, that would be very helpful. A lot of these cases, frankly, involve somebody who has mental health issues. So again, I think mental health counseling would be very helpful in many of those cases. But again, that would really run counter to this ideology, which basically very strongly emphasizes believing the victim. And I would be very curious to know, like in Teresa's conversations with the students, what was the outlook in terms of the whole believe the survivor the principle, because I think that's really one of the things that that also needs to be addressed. We're not really addressing the consent education, which I think promotes this very, very unrealistic and kind of bizarre idea of consent as something that has to be sort of like constantly verbally negotiated. Even if you're in an ongoing relationship, there has to be explicit consent to each encounter at every step. And I think the thing is that if you look at interviews with young people, I think most of them are really not practicing this, which is understandable, because sex really just doesn't work that way. But the problem is that given these rules, and given that they're not really being challenged, you have a situation where people are sort of constantly in violation of the written rules, so that if something goes wrong, it's very easy for somebody to be accused of being in violation, because you're really not kind of doing things by the book. And I think that is something that that also needs to be addressed. I guess one last thing that I would like to add here, and again, like Joseph, I really don't want to politicize this, but I don't know how that can possibly be avoided when we're, a few days away from an election. I think that it would be very, very helpful to start, at least trying to not depoliticize it, but, really kind of try to reach across the aisle, so to speak. Because, a lot of the people who have been the strongest critics of Title IX in its current form, like Laura Kipnis, whom Teresa Manning mentioned just now, are fairly staunch liberals and fairly staunch Democrats. A lot of the criticism of Title IX, prior to the Betsy DeVos reforms, came from liberal law professors. There were, I think, at one point something like 28 professors or 22 professors at Harvard, including leading feminist law professors like Janet Halley and Jeannie Sue Gersten, who signed this letter essentially saying that, these are rules that completely violate due process. So I think there is, Aya Gruber is a feminist author who, a feminist law professor and author, who has been very outspokenly critical of the sort of over criminalization of what is essentially consensual but possibly problematic sex. So I think there is a big kind of constituency among the more liberal segments, among among liberal Democrats, for restoring due process. And I think it would be really important you know, if we do have a Biden administration, and I think it would be, you know, inevitably, I think we have to mention that Joe Biden was one of the people who spearheaded the 2011 Dear Colleague letter. And, and I think it would be very, very important to really kind of mobilize the pro due process people on the Democratic side to ensure that, you know, if the next administration is going to be a Biden administration, that we have strong voices that will basically say, you know what, these rules should stay. These, you know, maybe with some tweaks, but, you know, essentially, we really should be upholding due process. It's, you know, it's not a conservative, it's a Republican value. It's a value that really should be of concern to all of us as Americans, and will make for a much healthier campus environment. So I think, you know, I'm just going to end there, and you know, that's that. But thank you very much for the report, by the way. That's you know, that was a great effort.
Yeah.
Thank you for your remarks, which have started up all sorts of ideas here. I'm going to start with the questions that have come in from members of the audience. First one is anonymous, but it appears to be directed to Teresa. And this person asks, why does the report not address the financial cost to universities of the Dear Colleague letters? There were several. And the expansion of Title IX that resulted in those costs. They're so substantial that those costs, of butchering this a bit, have been passed on to students through higher tuition. So why didn't you go there, Teresa?
Well, the report does touch on that issue in the context of administrative load, and certainly Title IX offices, diversity and equity inclusion offices, even affirmative action, these are all part of the problem of a growing massive administration within colleges and universities, highly compensated, and of course, passing on those increased costs to tuition in terms of increased tuition. So the report does address that, along with the conflict of interest, really, that Title IX officials have. I mean, if there's no problem, there's no reason for them to be there. There's no job. So as Peter knows, I toyed with the title of arsonist in the firehouse for this report, that it's hard not to see Title IX officials as starting fires that then they need to put out to justify their jobs. So the report did not go into detail about coordinator salaries or administrative salaries, but it definitely mentioned this problem of administrative bloat, this problem of administrative expense, and at least in passing, these costs going to students in the form of higher tuition.
I can add to that the National Association of Scholars is in the late stages of another report that does deal with administrative bloat and the costs of over-regulation of higher education, which right now are compounding because of the COVID-19 shutdown and the fiscal crisis that has afflicted the vast majority of colleges and universities. So it's a good question. Our answer, I guess, is going to be deferred until late February or early March when we release that next report. Be back here and watch us release it. Another question is, when you say falsely accused, and I'm not sure who the you is, it could be any one of you, what do you mean? I think I'm going to start by asking Joseph that. I don't know if you said it, but do you have an idea of what falsely accused means?
Yeah, I do. Falsely accused is when you're accused of something that you didn't do. In the Title IX sense, it's a false accusation stems from the weaponization of the policy. In my experience, I want to teach you a lesson, so I'm going to use the rules or the policy against you. It wasn't, at the time, and I'm pretty sure to this day, there's no secret that there's certain things that you can say to initiate an investigation or just initiate any type of expulsion or proceeding against a targeted person. I mean, um, accused, more specifically falsely accused students, are extremely vulnerable because there's no safeguard. And when it comes to the he said, she said argument, there isn't an arbiter of fact or truth. Um, in the early beginning, it was based on the preponderance. That preponderance was often susceptible to a unconscious bias, usually along the lines of height, weight, gender, race. You could just pick one, and it's normally just all three. And that bias was along the lines of not only of the investigator, but also against the accused person. So falsely accused is, I guess in the layman's sense, lies against an individual to trigger an expulsion and or a suspension. To make it even more lay, false accusations are tools to screw a person's life up.
I think I'm going to take that as a fully adequate answer, although others may want to comment on
Yeah,
it
actually,
further.
I just wanted to real quick sort of chime in on this. I think that falsely accused is a term that in the context of these Title IX cases, I think can mean several different things. One is that there's a story, there's just a completely made up accusation. Something that just didn't happen, and for one reason or another, somebody um just concocted a kind of like in the University of Virginia case, where there was, although there wasn't a specific person accused in that case, but there was a claim against a specific fraternity, which I think got vandalized, of a gang rape that just didn't happen, as we later learned. So that's, and there have been cases like that that have involved specific people where it was just something that was made up out of whole cloth. However, I think that there are also cases in which, where there's a case in which there's like clearly consensual sex and somebody knowingly, falsely reports a rape, whether out of vindictiveness or whatever. But there are also cases, and this is why, by the way, I sometimes really prefer the term wrongly accused, where you can have not even really a misstatement of facts, but facts kind of spun and presented in such a way that a really consensual or somewhat ambiguous sexual experience is turned into a sexual assault. And I think one way in which that happens especially is in cases involving alcohol, where the factual presentation may in fact be accurate, but do we embrace this interpretation, which now exists on many college campuses, that essentially any sort of intoxicated sex may be redefined ex post facto as sexual assault if one of the parties decides that this was unwanted or unwelcome. And I think that is why, again, I really prefer to use the term wrongly accused, because in some of these cases, there isn't really a lie per se. It's not like somebody making up something that didn't happen. It's really more the spin that is being put on something that actually did happen. And as I was saying, I think the framing of sexual assault in current campus discourse really enables that, because it promotes this very kind of vague and infinitely elastic interpretation of consent and sexual assault.
The person who asked that question has written back in to say she's very happy with the answer. So good job.
Peter, could I chime in and address a couple things?
Sure.
Or, I wanted to mention about Kathy saying the underlying problem with respect to this long-term relationship, because it does seem some of these problems are personal and not so legalistic. And it brings us full circle to my beginning comment about an equal access law as opposed to a criminal law, or personal matters as opposed to legalistic laws. Title IX is a discrimination ban. It's an equal access law. And one issue, it's a head scratcher, hearing about relationship problems and years of potential sexual abuse, is where does educational access fit into this? And I'm sad to report that though the new regulations are very good in many, many respects, it does allow now for simply the category of sexual assault and stalking and dating violence to be considered a Title IX matter that is a discriminatory matter without any regard toward educational access. While in effect, this is a license to meddle from Title IX bureaucrats. And I think this speaks to the point of these definitions which have found their way into school policies, which are unrealistic, including affirmative consent standards, where every stage of sexual intimacy must have explicit and verbal consent, which changes the entire nature of the encounter. We've transformed romance and dating into such a minefield that, as Joseph has pointed out, it does allow for the weaponization of dating and romance. Now, there's a possibility of seeing this as by design. I had considered writing one essay called Title IX Pain, but Terrific Porn. You know, you're making healthy romance impossible and then making unhealthy encounters inevitable, something like that, that in order for the Title IX offices to rationalize their jobs, in order for their cultural change to take effect, they have to have access to these relationships and these mishaps and try to redesign the whole thing. So in the end, it becomes a license to meddle into the personal and private encounters of students. And we are very far afield from equal access to education.
I've got a lot of questions here, so I'm going to ask the panelists to try to keep their answers fairly terse so we can get to as many questioners as possible. One person writes, here's a falsely accused example. Both parties agree they should use a condom. They get going with sex and the condom isn't used. The boy is then accused of assault and kicked out of school. Not a question there, but I guess is that an adequate example of a false accusation?
Right. Well, you know, I think that that could be. I mean, that's that conceivably could be, you know, a case like that. I think, you know, I'm just trying to think of like some of the specific cases that I've dealt with in you know, writing about these stories, and really a lot of them really do have to do with alcohol. There was the case that I wrote about that was probably the most high-profile case that I wrote about of you know, the mattress, the so-called mattress girl at Columbia University, and this was kind of an interesting case because there were 3 different accusations that were made against this person who was eventually like basically exonerated. And this was also, by the way, this is something I'm sorry to sort of interrupt myself, but I think we should also keep in mind that the campus culture is an important part of this, because in several of these cases, as with, you know, Dan Copin and in the mattress girl case, the student who was accused was actually exonerated. And then the situation was really made like pretty much unlivable for him on campus, because the accuser or the accusers in the Mattress Girl case sort of unleashed this intense activism that mobilized people against the accused. You know, in the Columbia case, there were graffiti left in the women's bathroom, you know, that named him as a rapist. And, you know, there were people coming into his classroom to take pictures of him, and there were people, you know, writing threats on Facebook and so on. And yeah, there were other things. And he eventually did, by the way, win a nice settlement from Columbia. So there was kind of a happy-ish ending for him. And he was able to collect his diploma. And the young woman, by the way, was sort of explicitly campaigning to get him kicked out of school. Like, she was basically, you know, she had this class project where she was walking around carrying a mattress, and she said, I'm going to be doing this until either I graduate or he leaves campus. So she made it very clear that her goal was to kind of get him kicked out. But the thing that was interesting, so there was initially one accusation that was made, and I think that one really was a kind of from, as far as I was able to kind of glean from all the evidence, I think the first accusation really was a kind of false in the classic sense of just being a lie, because there were so many details that this young woman mentioned that just didn't match. You know, like she claimed that she told at different times, like different stories about whom she discussed this with. Like she at first she said that she remained silent for months. Then she said that she immediately talked about it to a friend. So it just, there were just too many conflicting accounts.
Okay, let me cut you off on that, because we really do have to get to some other questions.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
At the very beginning, I mentioned that there were 600 schools that had, or 600 cases that had gone to court. One person is asked whether any of these involved Harvard University. Teresa or Kathy, do you know?
I don't know.
Kathy?
Yeah, I can't think of any case at Harvard, interestingly enough. I don't really know.
Okay.
Yeah, that is a good question. No, it's not coming back to me. No.
Okay. Have we identified any schools that do this Title IX work regarding the Dear Colleague letter well? They address campus sexual assault and violence in a wholesome way. Teresa, you've been doing that research. What do you think?
I have never encountered anyone who has been satisfied with a Title IX proceeding. All of the people that I have encountered, now that may be self-selected, but anyone with any Title IX personal and direct experience has not been pleased with that experience. More often than not, they are traumatized and upset by it. That doesn't mean that no institution could do it well. I tend to think, because again, this is a square the circle situation, the staff are not trained to assume these responsibilities. They have no relevant legal experience of the type I discussed at the beginning of this webinar. So given the lack of experience, the presence of ideology, it would be hard to imagine how a satisfactory proceeding could take place, actually.
Okay, so the answer is no. Could you say a word about how you learned about how colleges are complying with or evading the new OCR regulations? I take it that means the August regulation.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen reports, for example, from schools such as Tulane and Princeton, who do not want to observe the new due process requirements. And they want to define forbidden or prohibited conduct more broadly than what the new Title IX regulations allow. So there's been a lot of talk about how Title IX now has 3 categories of conduct that it prohibits. First, the quid pro quo proposition. Second, the type of sexual harassment that is severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, such that it denies educational access. And then a third category of sexual assault. So some people say, well, what if there is conduct that is severe, but it's not pervasive? Or what if it's pervasive, but it's not severe? We'd like to ban that type of conduct. So schools actually are free in their own student conduct codes to ban conduct such as that. And they are therefore creating a second track. So you've got the Title IX conduct that's subject to due process requirements, and then a second track that is the school's own prohibited conduct. Now, I wrote an essay on this, and there is a catch, which is to say that all school disciplinary proceedings, whether officially Title IX or not, still have to be non-discriminatory. They still have to comply with Title IX. And
Okay.
we have...
Gotcha on that. How does this report fit with all the related research in this area? I think this could be for both Kathy and you. What does the overwhelming consensus say about campus sexual assault? Does this field generally agree that it's not a problem?
Well, I think the political actors have really taken over here. You have invested constituencies, starting with the campus bureaucracy itself, which is the report presents how Title IX coordinators and adjudicators all think that sexual misconduct is rampant and a huge problem on campus. They have this conflict of interest, a vested interest in saying that this is a problem on campus. However, if women on campus were experiencing sexual assault and rape in such high numbers, I don't think we would see the numbers of women on campus that we do. Since the late 1970s, women actually outnumber men as both undergraduate and graduate students. They are getting degrees in greater numbers. They are participating in activities in greater numbers. So the experience of most people is that these numbers of rampant sexual assault are not real. Instead, they are peddled by people who stand to have jobs, get research grants, or be hired by political organizations. They're the ones claiming that. I don't know if Kathy wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think the research in this area has been incredibly politicized since, again, like not even since the 90s, but since the 80s. Like the first major report on this was sponsored by Ms. Magazine, which is a pretty radical feminist magazine, and they were the ones who did the first big study on this. And that was done, I mean, interestingly enough, by the way, the psychologist who did that, Mary Koss, has since sort of backed off some of the things that she was once sort of advocating. And I think she believes that things have gone a little bit too far in redefining a lot of different things as sexual assault. But again, it's been very politicized from the beginning. There was a kind of push to, and still is, a push to prove that, American society is this patriarchal, quote unquote, rape culture in which, rape is normalized and, male sexual entitlement is normalized, and, women are socialized to sort of be submissive and so on and so forth. And I think that really shapes a lot of this research, so-called research, because I think a lot of it is really kind of research with a predetermined conclusion. And I think that's a real problem. And I think when we have these definitions of sexual assault that in many cases define sexual assault as being talked into sex, when you've initially sort of expressed reluctance, or as sex involving any sort of real degree of intoxication. Again, not talking about somebody who's passed out and, taken advantage of in that condition, but somebody whose judgment is maybe somewhat impaired. So I think, again, a lot of the research has use these very, very kind of confusing definitions that are really intentionally used to generate a very large number of sexual assaults. Well, I mean, just to add real quick, one type of study that has consistently shown a very low number of sexual assaults on campus is the Bureau of Justice Statistics Criminal Justice Survey, which is really the only kind of gold standard criminological survey in which people are specifically asked about being attacked. So, you know, in terms of like women who actually do believe that they've been assaulted, the numbers are very, very low, and they are lower on campus, not surprisingly, than for some of the off-campus populations of the same age. So again, if we're talking about specific criminological studies, those actually show that sexual assault on campus is really quite rare.
Okay, so the campus discourse from Title IX people and campus feminists says one thing, but the facts say something else. We do have an answer, by the way, to the Harvard question from one of the participants here. There are 2 cases against Harvard. I don't know if they're pending or resolved, but there were at least 2 cases. Question for Joseph. How does a person who is wrongly suspended or expelled and who cannot afford to sue the university regain his good name? You need to turn your mic on. You're still muted. There you go.
Okay, okay, great. You know, to answer that question, I was in that same position, you know, under-resourced, you know, back against the wall. You know, I mean, everybody thought that, I mean, to put it simply, that I was a rapist harasser in the Deep South. Good luck with that. You know, I asked around. I just would, to be honest, higher power. It was a higher power for me, and God's grace. I met and consulted with several attorneys. Some of them would give me advice, but I mean, by no means at that time would any of them be willing to represent me. I had to represent myself in federal court. No legal background, no nothing, but just the wherewithal to protect my reputation. So I white knuckled it. I white knuckled the pleadings. I did my own research in the law library. Reached out to fire. You know, they would just throw me bones along the way, and I put together a pleading. Packed all my stuff, and I was driving a Toyota Prius at the time. Moved to DC. Started doing research in the Law Library of Congress, and I put it together. You know, the outcome of my case, and litigation for me, going at a pro se litigant against not just the university, but the university is represented by the state's attorney. Yeah, I got avalanched. I got steamrolled. It was right around that time when I started finding out that I wasn't the only one. My advice to someone that's under-resourced is there are organizations with the infrastructure and the bandwidth to help you. You're going to need help on 2 different sides. You're definitely going to need help on the legal side, but the most important thing is protecting your mental headspace. Not only yours if you're going through it, but if you're a parent, the mental headspace of yourself and the people that you love too. It's a long road, but my journey has taught me that, being under-resourced, it's not at a disadvantage, because I met people along the way who've been fully resourced and had access to different nodes and the strength of a network that they should just be able to slam dunk a wrongful accusation. And, you know, some of my peer group, they've been treated worse than I was. You know, along the way, I went through an identity crisis. I felt like, hey, I was falsely accused or wrongly accused, and maybe there was a reason why I deserved to be treated like this, because, to be quite honest, I'm poor. I've met families that own things that I will never own, who have sons who were falsely accused, and I had to reconcile the emotion of, if anybody was going to be treated this way, it definitely wouldn't be them.
I
So,
have a follow-up question here, which is, what organizations can people in that situation turn to?
as far as support, I would definitely say FACE, Families Advocating for Campus Equality. Great support network for falsely accused or wrongfully accused students to support each other, as well as the network of parents too. They do great work over there. As far as policy is concerned, I would highly recommend FIRE. Now, as far as like influence on the Hill and with legislative, I would say SAVE. Those are the three that I'm most familiar with. I mean, there are outside tertiary organizations that, depending on their area of interest, like the ACLU, but I'd say all roads eventually lead back to those three.
Okay, FACE, FIRE, and SAVE. We have to wrap up. We're out of time almost anyway. I have an interesting sort of little essay that just came in from someone who's not asking a question, but asserting something interesting. Let me read part of this. Nothing will right the balance unless and until there are absolute rights both to have the accused engage counsel and, equally important, to have discovery rights, the same as in a civil proceeding. Until schools start getting tagged with losses in due process cases like that, or until donors are turned off by the unfairness to men in these proceedings, nothing will change. Boards are the only entity that can push back, and most won't focus on it. They outsource it to experts who give the result the liberal administrations want, which is why you see colleges keeping the same dear colleague rules even after the new DeVos rule. I'll stop with that there. I have not asked any question of my own, so I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to ask just one. I've noted throughout this discussion the proliferation of a new vocabulary to talk about sex and sexual relations. All of this has now become very familiar, believing the victims, survivors. We saw some of this trotted out in the national scene with the Kavanaugh hearings. The forms of lawfare and activism that we've encountered have introduced these notions of consensualness, mixed signals, new variations of the idea of how responsibility should be divided up in the extremely fraught and murky area of sexual relations. So my question is, has this regime on campus, the Title IX regime, brought this vocabulary into play, had made it the way in which we now think about sexual relations among young people? Or has Title IX in this form simply caught up with a cultural change that was already well underway, as Kathy Young described in the 1990s? I'd like each of you to comment on that, and then we'll stop.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think that it definitely is a kind of feedback loop, so to speak. I think this is something that began with feminist activism, really going back to the 70s. And I do want to say that, initially there were some real injustices that were being addressed. There was in many criminal cases, there was this sort of tendency to kind of blame the victim if she was seen as having acted provocatively, or if she was seen as, having a bad reputation. So I think that there were real issues that were being addressed by this activism, but there were also from the beginning very radical people like Susan Brown Miller, who's a radical feminist theorist who wrote a book in 1975 called Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, in which she advanced this really kind of paranoid kind of conspiracy theory, if you want to use the word, that essentially rape is a form of deliberate collective terrorism by which, as I believe she put it, all men keep all women in a state of fear. So it was this mindset from the beginning that saw, rape as not one person's individual bad act against another, but as part of this, male system of terrorizing women. And I think that definitely kind of fed into the campus atmosphere eventually with the Ms. Magazine survey and with the sort of redefinition of consent. So I think that it came from outside campus I'm just going to wrap this up. And, then I think Title IX was really used to enforce this ideology. And I'm not going to say that everyone who's involved in Title IX enforcement is this, rabid feminist ideologue, but I think it was definitely a part of the campus scene. So again, I think it is a mutual feedback situation where some of this comes to campus via activism, and then it sort of influences the broader culture, which it certainly has done. And I think it certainly has kind of influenced the broader language, this language of survivors and, believe the survivor. And of course, when you say believe the survivor, that already presupposes guilt, essentially, because you're saying that you do regard this person as a survivor of sexual assault before you even really established any facts. So I think that language is really quite insidious, and I think definitely there's this mutual influence process between the campus and the wider culture.
Joseph?
Let's see, am I unmuted?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, I want to agree with Kathy. I think one of the biggest catchphrases that kind of started from the campus movement was Me Too. It's interesting, right? My experience was in 2013. This was about 3 years before the Me Too movement. But even my time in college, I always felt like as an undergrad that college campuses and universities are kind of just like microcultures for just a bigger society, right? There was a Me Too movement that took universities by storm, and then years later, here it is. It's called Me Too. That's just one small example. So yeah, I do agree that the college and university experience, it definitely influences the greater society.
And Teresa?
Title IX has unfortunately been completely weaponized, and certainly Title IX offices are major contributors to enmity and acrimony between male and female students on campus. They can only justify and keep their jobs if there are Title IX complaints and problems between male and female students. There is a natural tension between men and women. That's a fact of life, and it is in part the attraction that exists between men and women. Historically, sexual passion has been referred to as fire, something that has to be controlled and channeled. From my observations and experiences, these Title IX ideologues are playing with fire, they are starting fires, and a lot of people are getting burned.
Well, that's a great closing for this. Teresa, Kathy, Joseph, thank you very much for this really fascinating seminar. We had a lot more questions we didn't get to, and good things in the chat, which I hope you'll follow up on. And I hope you'll be back with us again soon. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
For the report, Teresa.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay.